All right, so welcome everybody. Thank you very much for joining us. I'm Ellen Wiles. I'm a creative writing lecturer at Exeter University, and I'm delighted to be hosting this mini-series, Speaking of Writing, on behalf of the university's creative writing team. It's a series of Friday lunchtime events featuring brilliant women writers of colour. And today we're focusing on poetry, and we're extraordinarily lucky to have two of our most imaginative, dynamic and exciting poets working today. Vani Campadeo. Hi, Vani.
Hey.
And Maya Chowdhry. Hi, Maya. So, to introduce them, Vani Campadeo is a Trinidadian Scottish writer of poetry and non-fiction, inspired by other voices ranging from Indian diaspora background to the northern landscapes where Capildeo travelled and now lives. They've published 8 books and 7 pamphlets of poetry, including Measures of Expatriation in 2016, which was awarded the prestigious Forward Prize for Best Collection. After their DPhil in Old Norse literature, which they have worked in academia, in Cultures for Development, with Commonwealth writers, and as an OED lexicographer. Their most recent collection, Skin Can Hold, published in 2019, offers interactive texts about masquerade and embodiment, and was composed during writing fellowships at Cambridge and Leeds universities. Now Capildeo is writer-in-residence at the University of York, and their themes there are silence, crisis, and excess. A forthcoming collection, Like a Tree Walking, which will be published in 2021 by Carcanet, includes a praise poem to trees, which doubles as a stillness exercise. And luckily for all of us, Vani will read some of these poems today, and we'll even get the chance to participate in the tree poem exercise together at the end of this event. Maya Chowdhry is a poet, interactive artist, and activist. Her work spans radio, theatre, video, and live art, and all of these forms influence her creative practice. Her multimodal work includes a digital poem, Soil Voicemails and Other Trans-Species Calls, which was commissioned for a Science Museum project and which we'll explore today, and Ripple, which is an augmented reality poetic piece, which was shortlisted for the 2015 Dot Award. Her immersive story, Tales from the Towpath, was co-authored for the Manchester Literary Festival and shortlisted for the International New Media Writing Prize. She's the author of Butterfly Orchid in 2017. Her most recent poetry pamphlet is called Fossil and was published by People Tree in 2016. And Maya uses storytelling and interactive theatre making to create immersive and democratic experiences for participants, interrogating issues like climate change, seed sovereignty, food justice, and other social justice issues. She's currently working on an interdisciplinary citizen science project with the National Oceanography Centre. So we're going to start off today by diving right into these poets' work with some readings, and then we'll move on to some discussion and questions. So Vani, thank you so much for offering to share some poems from your upcoming collection. Would you like to say a few words perhaps about the collection and then read some for us?
Hi. Yes, the collection is called Like a Tree Walking, and it'll be coming out with Carcanet next year. And it slightly remixes a series of walks, lullabies, and nocturnes, which are appearing completely as a separate pamphlet from Oystercatcher called The Dusty Angel. But I only sampled a very few of those and mostly wrote new material, very much based around doing silence exercises in the company of trees, which sounds a little bit odd, but we'll all do one of those later. I'm going to start by reading what I call plague poems. So shortly after the pandemic became world news, I can't say after it started because I'm not entirely sure when it started, I was locked down in Trinidad where the borders were closed by the Prime Minister, who has a science background and had a clear and stringent plan from the beginning. And straight off the bat, I wrote a sequence of 5 poems from the point of view of several different imaginary narrators, trying to project ahead what the consequences of lockdowns around the world might be. And I dedicated them to Jack Bellolly, I always get the stress wrong, whose Twitter bio used to read the woke monk of Twitter, and now reads that he is avoiding the reproduction of harm. Plague Poems Excerpt 1. Now we are things invisible. The inessential park is closed. Its benches clean of homeless bodies, hurting less in sleep. Cigs, wasteful pansies, gratuitous marigolds, dogs running like flames, and vaguely sinister statues are out like fountains in drought. The wrong romances will not fall among its turning leaves. Who'd make a fearful call, craving escape from beatings, can't expect to coast on help from public services? The sky is a roof only to birds and drones, no place to lose the words of crazy makers. You can grow your inward silence indoors now the inessential park is closed. Memory restyles it like a scroll, adding some willows and a bridge to which you run to catch a wish. The visible, unusable park, its blue imagined bridge, for love of things invisible. 2. Plague fidelity. You may kiss me as much as you like. I wish you would. I always wish you would. I wish you always would. You're the only one allowed to kiss me. The sciences, lack of touch can make you ill, even physically. Sometimes when you breathe, I start breathing just like you. Do you remember grandmothers? Poems about grandmothers. You said life's not like that. Could be. Remember asking, laughing, why I write, used to, about the sea? Kiss me. Tell me where you are. The next poem is based on the myth of Actaeon, who saw the goddess Artemis or Diana bathing in a pool and was turned into a deer and torn apart by his own dogs. I love that story. Reader, I turn men into deer. Told me about a childhood, running free through rainforest. Those were the best days. On all those paths he never saw a snake. Told him about childhood within walls, snake in the postbox, snakelet unearthed wriggling, never seen snake of the drain, moving heavy stones we put to block its resting place. Yard had the displaced inhabitants of forest. He would have been running through with his gun and smoke-bright eyes. Decades and decades. What you see, what you do, what you say, what you know, what you believe, what you have been storing, yourself in storage, your storied self. Decades and decades is dangerous. Forest becomes forensics. The frond is dissected. Oh, it waves over all those paths. Equivocations. You see, you do, to me, as if I am a woman. Come on, he says, to control. Coming on, he knows. Control. You believe the narratives. What thorns mistaken for companions? What canopy? What shutting out? He disks his eyes. His hooves hurt. The next poem is one of a two-parter written for recent work press in Canberra, who did an anthology called Giant Steps, which was commemorating the Apollo moon landings, as a lot of people were doing. For whom the moon? What is a moon? What is a mind? What is a man? An area of darkness. What is a mare? A getaway. What is an astronaut? He carries out instructions, obedient and armored fetus, whose woven and worn lunar tether could be any hiker's fail-safe terracotta litter, if not returned to preserve with glass care, a memory few will ever have, and some still say didn't happen. Oh, tell us, earth of breathable fabric, earth of eyes. Oh, tell us who we will not. Earth of spontaneous color, earth of fools. Oh, tell us who we will not send, unquenchable earth, to the moon. The next poem, which I'm not going to read, is the second half and suggests sending fair to middling housekeepers. And no, the last one I'm going to read before you have the extraordinary pleasure of encountering Maya's digital art is called Violent Triage. I had started writing a play about Actaeon, who was turned into the end ripped apart by his own dogs, and then I recanted it. I started thinking how our good habits of critical examination and critical processes within the mind have been overtaken by automatic violent triage of ourselves and our neighbours. Violent triage. Poets, you spoke like stones in water, going against the grain, wearying and refreshing. What you gain in true reflection is reflected in lost income. That was then. And since then, what we learnt is truth must feel hard and be a process. Violent triage. When did it start? Have you applied your skills to that? Or are you still above origins? Violent triage. Between the violet and varied green, did it slip past your guard, flashing fake ID, modelled after pleasure pain? Check in with me, check up on me, interrogate me like nobody interrogated me, caress me in an agreed fashion, transfer the Christmas list to an Excel sheet, excavate this for me. Violent triage. Did it start with a game? Seed head fluff, blow that. Love, friendship, hate, marry, adore. Cross out the letters of your classmates' names to get results. Is a BuzzFeed quiz the acute phase of, the soft face of, violent triage? Congratulations. Your color is indigo. Check out your soulmates who are indigo too. When did you aspire to be spiritual but not religious? Before or after supersized duty-free 3-for-2 chocolate bars? Relaxed you and revved you up for online dating, the mysterious appeal of stranger danger. Big data is just the boy next door. When were you complicated in public? Before or after you began withholding coins from beggars who had that look or that look? Who is the heroine in this case? Violent triage, help them by not helping, and are you a soft summer or a bright spring? I was writing a poem with dogs running, and I wanted to distinguish them, the curled one, the deep-chested, the ridge runner, a poem with dogs running after their master, a hunter who turned into a deer. But I couldn't finish violent triage. Have you ever recanted a poem? This puts you in the percentage of people who... The doorbell was ringing. The downstairs American Oxford neighbours wanted to check by chatting on the intercom if I was doing terrorism. I was doing transcriptions. Have you any idea whether those are citizens beside you on the bus? She wasn't even baptized, but she declared for Catholic. Which saint then? It just kills me. Poets, do you live near water? Or how many footsteps away? And how many footsteps in a day do you take towards water? It is advisable but not enforceable to throw stones. This will raise the volume. Unless you are in the situation of which child for school, which for the cotton harvest. Testing times. But do you think we could ever be like that, violent triage? Do you have smart goals, scared, measurable, achievable, reproductive, televisual? Violent triage, whether in pastel, rose gold, or electric blue, is viral in our minds, crowning that other virus. Natural to ask, who is dead? Who's as good as? Violent triage, plan accordingly. Did Google translate you as disponible or disposable? Cross yourself when you pass a burial ground. What about when you see a smartphone? But you were indigo. You can't be expected to see cobalt. Did Google translate you as available or valuable? Bow your head when you pass a cemetery. But you have Venus and Aquarius and are more likely to keep it cool. Let me do your chart. Let me pull a card. Violent triage, dream of a tidy resurrection, because the angels can't be left wing. From rows of graves will pop like municipal tulips. Don't imagine they'll arise up then, citizens of everywhere, the vast unmarked. In what eschatology does death lead to decolonization? The sea will push up too many timbered heads. Violent triage, stories of how it all ends. What is a critical faculty? What kind of sickness? We all suffer from something. Violent triage, a new poetics, silence of the heart. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vani. Wow, what a fantastic and fantastically varied set of poems. Wonderful to hear, and really look forward to the whole of the new collection and to discussing it shortly. So now on to Maya. You're going to be presenting some fascinating examples of your digital poetry, which, audiences, please prepare for some poetic mind-bending here and interactive art. So I will hand over to you now, Maya.
Okay, just getting the screen ready. So this is actually a digital poem, which is a film, but because of trying to stream on Zoom, I've made it into a presentation. So I'm just going to play a few screenshots as I read the poem. And after I've done the reading, I will share the link to the actual film so you can kind of get the idea of the full digital piece. A projector instructs a seed on how to grow in a post-human world. Caution: do not read humanness into any of these instructions. The exclamation point within an equilateral triangle is intended to alert the user to the presence of important operation and maintenance. 1. Intended use. I am sun to you, seed. My burning light tricks you into sensing warmth, into casting aside your winter skin, having a feeling for growing. You soften. In this permeance, absorb soil molecules and stutter green breaths. 2. Safety labels. I instantly regret this LED trickery when you shiver and die of starvation in the cold, barren winter earth. 3. Package contents. Later, I switch on, shine my photons, peer into the dense blackness of soil, sense a faint electrical current with my diode. It is the snores of you sleeping. 4. Installation. A. I made a mistake, you're alive. B. I light up the possibility that my crystal rectifier and your cells could be alive from opposite ends of the spectrum. Z. I am light. Not sunlight, but 21st century protons intermingling with 2 million tiny mirrors and a thermomic tube. Surely you can see that. 5. Adjusting the projected image. I feel inferior to the brilliance and power that is the planet of sun. I am human-made. I am made for entertainment. I would like to have a purpose beyond my inbuilt obsolescence. If you could just consider my rays as the growing mechanism. 6. Adjusting the projector focus. I've read my circuits and it should be possible. Think allegory of the cave meets digital micro mirror device, a cell chimera of a cyborg. 7. User controls. Puppets flickering on a wall. Shadow play meets the 12 noon reflection of the sun on a branch. These are all ways we could control each other. 8. What's in the box? Mine contains a kaleidoscope of pixels and tiny tilting mirrors, less than 1/5 diameter of a human hair. I long for X-ray vision to see beyond your imbibition. 9. Source unknown. 13. Troubleshooting. I committed an error and caused you to begin growing in an unsafe way. Is there any possibility you could begin to see more than green light, and I could shine my red and blue liquid crystal light values with you? Where's my mouse gone? Okie dokie, slight technical error there with the mouse. Okay, so this next piece, Soil Voicemails and Other Trans-Species Calls, is a digital poem and it was commissioned by the Science Museum. I'm not able to present it full screen because it's on the web as well. And I'm just going to play the first half of that, and then also I'll share the link to that because it's a poem that the audience should be interacting with.
could sing, I see your voice.
Ideal soil, calling across species. So that's the first half of the poem, and the second half you'll have to explore by clicking on the link. It works best in Chrome browser, and I'll put the link into the chat shortly. And this is Seed, Jindes. The seeds have sown themselves secretly, decipher their passage, braid by black braid. While white mustard blooms on Hindustani soil, leave Supara for the Erythraean sea. The soil of one continent transposed must be sold at any price. That's me, thank you.
Thank you so much, Maya. As you can see, this presentation alone really demonstrates the boundless possibilities of poetry in a digital age, and I hope that was just a little introduction to the rich variety of Maya's work. So I'd really encourage you to all click on the link in your own time and try out Cross the Lines, as Maya suggests. It's really fun and therapeutic as well as thought-provoking. So thank you so much. All right, well, so let's move on to some questions and discussion. I have many, I know. I'd like to start off by asking you both about the role of interactivity in your work and how you involve your audiences. Because Vani, you've published poetry that you describe as interactive and that explores the idea of masquerade in your Skin Can Hold collection. And of course, Maya, you define yourself as an interactive artist. So Maya, would you like to speak first to this about the role of interactivity in your work?
Yeah, so my work is entirely about the conversation with the audience. That is, I write work for myself, for other people, for organizations, but when I decide to put it out into the world, I'm putting it out into the world to have a conversation with the audience, and that conversation happens in lots of different ways. It can be gentle after a reading when you chat to the audience, or it can be provoked in different ways. And I use lots of different interactive strategies. So these digital poems, one of them, the Science Museum one, was commissioned this year, and I particularly wanted to make something that, given that we are kind of all thrown out to be on Zoom and not connecting with each other, to sort of explore what it would be like to connect with your screen and what interactivity do you have on your screen. And I think what's happened this year is lots of people whose computers were mainly for emails are now kind of exploring how could the computer and their phones be more of a creative device, and how could we co-create. And so in this piece, I mean, I moved my mouse on the screen for soil voicemails, but obviously, it depends how you want to interact with it. You might want to just listen to it and not click the screen at all. So, and obviously there's a second part, which I didn't go to, that kind of adds some extra layers to it.
Great, thanks. And on that subject of interaction via audience questions, if anybody has a question they'd like to ask, please do post it in the chat and I'll try to get to that. And Vani, would you like to speak a little bit about how you see interactivity in your work?
Yes, basically, I don't know whether any of you who've read Great Expectations might remember the bit where Pip hides a piece of bread and butter down his trouser leg, and Joe, who's turned his back and not seen him hide it, thinks he's eaten it and tells him that's the most uncommon bolt. I realised gradually that the way people read poetry tends to be in the form of a most uncommon bolt. They sort of swallow poems whole and don't really think about the pacing within a poem, or the pauses, or how many voices might be in one line, or whether I has remained as the same person, or whether the effect of it might be the effect of drift or an effect like music rather than a message. So in the more positive sense, I started thinking of what happens when people read aloud, and the work of Dr. Sam Duncan at UCL for the Reading Aloud in Britain Today project really sensitized me to that, and we eventually did an event together at the Scottish Poetry Library. And then also I was thinking of the embodied practice of reading, and whether people can sit up or if they have to lie down or move position, and whether it's primarily through the ears or the eyes or somebody else's voice. And what I had learned from reading texts with students and then translating that into immersive theatre. And I started writing poems which contained directions for readers to do this. I wouldn't say giving permission, because I don't really believe permission can be given, but rather trying to open up what people might unconsciously have closed down in terms of the possibilities of what you do with the book, other than just an uncommon bolt.
Yeah, so wonderfully put, and it's such an interesting idea that's really underexplored. I mean, I was lucky enough to have a copy before you read it of your poetry there, and just to witness the transformation of hearing it read with the pauses makes such a difference. And I think the role of the voice is and the body is such an interesting subject. How do you see that, Maya, in terms of the role of voice in your poetry? Do you write poetry mainly for performance, and do you give a lot of thought to the role of voice?
Absolutely. I mean, I've started to go back to live art a few years ago because I was making very sort of digital technical installations, and I kind of felt like that, and they were exploring things like world water scarcity, and I felt like I kind of got the human in there as a kind of, I had like say a webcam, and the human was operating a barcode, but I kind of felt like the conversation was missing, and kind of my voice was mediated through plants, which was interesting, but given what's happening with climate justice, I felt like I wanted to be more present. So I moved back into live art, which I hadn't done for a while, and really did concentrate on actually wanting to have a direct line to the audience's ear. So I made some audio poetic pieces, and then, really thinking about whether it's, in person as live art, or I'm kind of on an audio track speaking to the audience in their ear. It's such a different kind of tone from when you write from the page. So when you write from the page, I'm expressing it in a way, and I am communicating with line breaks and punctuation about the pace, and obviously the white space and things like that, and how I put things together. But I'm kind of giving more agency to the audience in one sense by having interactive pieces, but then in another sense, when I'm reading it, I'm thinking about my voice. The audience don't have any, say, choice to like skip through a stanza or something that they're not interested in. I do make some non-linear works, and yeah, really thinking about the fact that it's a female voice, and thinking very carefully about if I'm choosing to read my poems or somebody else's, or if I'm getting an actor to read and perform them. So yeah, lots of different choices and lots of different levels that affect how the poem is, like Vani said, read in all senses of the word read.
Yeah, absolutely. And Vani, when you were talking about your work with immersive theatre and your consideration to embodiment and involvement of the reader, but when you write most of your poems, do you tend to think of them as primarily for the page and as text, and the voice is secondary, or do you write them primarily for performance of the voice, or is it a balance?
Well, it's a mix, and it varies from book to book. So, for example, Skin Can Hold, which was my 2019 book from Coconut, was primarily texts for people to go and do things with, rip them up or remix them as any sort of performance they wanted. Then the new one, Like a Tree Walking, is very much a mix, and there's some that I'll never be able to read because the page is used more like a piece of visual art, and I try to do things with the ideas of simultaneity of voice or simultaneity of awareness of place when messing about the appearance of the poem on the page. So like Maya was saying, there isn't a linear way through. You just have to sit with it.
Yeah, absolutely. You've also spoken about the role of other voices as an inspiration for all of your work. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that idea. Oh, I think you're still muted.
Sorry, is that a question for me or for Maya?
Yeah, that's for you.
Okay, so one of the things is, and I wrote about this just recently for a piano review, that when people talk about plural lingualism, then they often think about having a capacity for thinking in or existing with a variety of different pidgins, dialects, languages, registers, whatever. Whereas I think it's also to do with how far one is auto-translating in one's mind. So even if one appears to be a monoglot speaker or writes only in one language, there may be overlays and interruptions of other voices. And so I've tried to be much more attentive to what's in my head when I'm writing a poem and treated it with respect rather than as a distraction. If I'm drafting and I think of either a quotation from a dead author or a conversation with somebody, it doesn't really matter in what language or a piece of advertising or a hymn or whatever. I put it down in the notes and wonder if it somehow belongs in the world of the poem, rather than saying we must edit that out to be tidy.
Yeah, fascinating. And Maya, could you talk a little bit about in terms of crossovers and communicating with different voices, but also different disciplines, about the nature of interdisciplinarity in your art making and how you move between forms and combine different forms, and perhaps how that's evolved over time?
Well, in terms of voice, the Projector poem is actually read out in a Projector voice. So that's when you go on the link to go to the film, you'll hear the Projector voice. And this is it's a very new poem that was just commissioned recently. And it was very interesting for me to read it out live, because I felt I wasn't really communicating the projectoriness, the kind of technicalness of this projector. And it sort of has changed actually how I think about the poem a bit. So it'd be interesting to see what people think about it when they hear it with the Projector voice. And so in terms of voices, there are other voices, and sometimes they come out when I'm thinking of, I really wanted to think about the sun, the light coming out of a projector and the sun, and the projector kind of having a station above itself to think that it could be the sun and make a seed grow. And I really wanted to try and get into that kind of projectory voice. It's quite a new poem. I think I'm kind of on the way with it. I think I'll probably revise it a little bit, but I made it into a printed version, which is like an instruction manual. So it's all in different languages and it's kind of folded up on kind of cheap paper, and it's coming out in a zine. So that's that one. In terms of like how work comes out in different ways, I mean, poetry is absolutely my first love, and I used to work for a women's film co-op, and I kind of felt like poetry and film really went together in terms of like the imagery of film, kind of show not tell, and the kind of imagery in poetry, a bit the same. And I feel like what happens is that the work kind of just goes in and out of itself, and it just comes out in different forms. I mean, sometimes it's because somebody like the Science Museum asked me for a poem and they said they would want a poem film, and I kind of wanted something more interactive. But sometimes it's that the form just sort of speaks to the subject matter, really, like in the kind of Projector and Seed piece, it really wanted to come out in a film. And in terms of, I mean, I see it all as art. I mean, I see my activism and art together, and I think that I've got something that I want to say to the world. And I guess the form would depend. Like, for example, the reason we're doing the zine at the moment is everything's gone very digital. And so we're kind of doing the zine to kind of put something in the hands of people, because people are a bit fed up with digital.
Yeah, no, there's such an array of digital options, and then so many ways in which our lives are now oriented towards the digital in a way they never have been before, particularly now as we can't all meet in person. Linking that to this question of form, Vani, I mean, you use such an imaginative array of poetic forms in your work. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what form means to you, and how that's changed over time, and also the extent to which the digital has affected that.
The digital hasn't affected it hugely for me, because unlike Maya, I don't have the skills. I'm quite a clumsy person anyway. So, I mean, I might mathematically be happy with digital things, but I don't visually, artistically have the skills to conceive work in that way. I'm very much a thing of words and silences. And it's much more to do for me with the politics of reception and connection. And I was speaking about this the other day in another context, that I am actually angry that it took a pandemic for people in the global north, or should we say Anglo-America, to start connecting with others via technologies like Zoom. I mean, not to name names, but they're definitely poets in Southeast Asia and South Asia I can think of, not to mention Latin America and the Caribbean, who've been forced to rely on these technologies, but who have also embraced them for the possibilities of connection and marvel. So why there had to be a negative impulse and people had to be shocked into unsettlement before they would connect makes me angry and sad. That's something I'm still working through. In terms of form, John Kinsella said an amazing thing the other day when we were doing a reading together for the University of Warwick. He said that he uses a lot of medieval forms, and that for him the poem is an act of dispossession, and that he is an act of dispossession. But those are the forms that he has, and he tries to use them in ways that are rebarbative and resistant. I think it's the same for me. I grew up very bookish, and also I tend to listen carefully to what's around me. So by this time, you know, in middle age, I've got a lot of forms knocking around in my head. And if they turn up when I'm concentrating on an image or an idea, then I will use them, but I try to use them in a fashion that's aware of where they've come from and how they might be received and by whom.
Absolutely, yeah, thanks. And thinking about, as you already mentioned, Maya, the idea of what poetry can do in reaching out to audiences, and to, you know, actually the possibilities of these online events of reaching out to audiences across borders, as Vani was saying. Could you talk a little bit about this, the idea of poetry as activism, and what poetry can do in terms of social justice and social change, and how you see your work in that sense? Maya, would you like to speak to that?
So I don't see a separation between the activism and the poetry. I think that I started writing poetry because I was, like Vani, angry about things in the world, racism growing up in Scotland, you know, sexism, homophobia. And so I don't see a separation, except that, except that the separation comes in that I might go on a march, which is different from a poem. But otherwise, my work is very much about social justice. And yeah, I'm not sure if I'm answering your question.
Yeah, no, I wonder about how you think that your poetry, what it contributes as a form of activism that you feel you wouldn't be able to achieve through other forms of activism.
Oh yeah, I get it now. Okay then. So I guess when you read a flyer with a particular kind of message on it, it's usually very direct, and it might be asking you to do something or think about something. I think the difference with poetry is those ideas are all in there, but it allows a lot more room for the reader to think about those ideas and to think about them in different ways. So for example, the Projector instructs a seed on how to grow in a post-human world. I'm looking at seed sovereignty as well, but it's not directly saying this poem is about seed sovereignty. We must you know, really value our seeds, otherwise we're going to end up with no food. It's not saying that, but there are all sorts of different ideas in it. And I guess the difference is leaving the room for the reader or the viewer to go on their own journey and to think about these ideas, and to maybe think, for example, with that poem, well, in fact, you will see that actually seeds is in the other poem as well. And to think about, well, why is Maya putting seeds in all her poems? Like, what is it about seeds? And for people to go on their own journey, basically. So I guess that's the difference, the kind of direct and indirect.
Yeah, thank you. And how about you, Vani? How do you see your work in the context of activism? Do you see the two as separate?
I definitely see the two as separate, in part because I see a pressure on poets to be documentary witnesses or to convey some type of message if they come from particular backgrounds, and not to give free expression to their imagination, however unruly or however quiet that might be. So I think there's an allied work of critical reception, critical thinking, reviewing, education, which goes with poetry being activated as activist. But in a way, what is activist about poetry is letting it alone, I'm increasingly believing. And another thing is which poetry is political. And I heard at a seminar recently somebody make an extraordinary and invalid distinction between political poetry and other poetry, because it occurred to me that the political is personal as well as the personal being political. And a poem that pretends not to be political has got its politics wrapped up in it. For example, that a particular kind of subjectivity is important to spend time with, that for language to behave well, it has to do X, Y, and Z things, that these are the appropriate topics of consideration. All of these are political choices as well as aesthetic. So basically, I would want to see the supposedly non-political poetry being read for its politics, and poetry in general being left alone otherwise.
Such a rich idea. And on that note, actually, you've alluded to the publishing industry there, and perhaps expectations, assumptions made about poets from particular backgrounds, about what they'll write and what significance that has. I wonder if you could just speak a little bit more about your experience of the literary and publishing industry, and even the wider cultural industry as writers of colour, and perhaps some thoughts on the dynamics of identity and perceived identity in that context. Vani, do you want to continue on that theme?
Yeah, I mean, first I'll say that I'm very bad at marketing and selling my work. So I'm not sure that, I also didn't do any creative writing degree. And so I'm not sure that I've got an overview of the publishing industry rather than a series of oblique connections to it. And it's quite clear to me that in the UK, reviews of poets of colour, when they happen, as has been studied by Dave Coates for the Ledbury Critics Project, that if Dave doesn't put it this way, I'll put it in a much more controversial way, is that reviewers, when they bother to pay attention, switch off their intelligence. So if there's a poem by a poet with a name that appears to be English and white, that poem will be read for its allusions and its cleverness. Whereas, for example, I wrote a poem that I thought was clever and elusive, just promptly pigeonholed as being about Trinidad and about my father. Neither of these things were true. It was about Roman remains in Bear's Den outside Glasgow. So there's this peculiar kind of divergence that happens between what any poet in a minority group thinks he, she, it, or they may have written, and then how perversely reviewers apply other identity lenses to it.
Yeah, so interesting and unfortunately present to hear that example of your experience. Maya, does that resonate with you? Do you feel that you've been misrepresented, misunderstood? How do you feel your poetry has been able to come through in the wider culture and publishing industry?
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel like lots of female identified writers would say that they are seen as women writers, not as a writer or a poet. So you're seen as a woman writer, and yeah, all the identity politics. Yeah, absolutely agree with what Vani's saying. And there have been, presses that have decided to set themselves up and certain prizes for people of colour, in order to just sidestep all of that, because really, as poets, as artists, it takes up a lot of energy dealing with all of this.
Yeah, of course, of course. Well, there's so much more we could talk about, but I'd love to create some space for audience questions. And we've had a question from Emma, which is, how does your writing process change when you write poetry to be read versus to be heard? So would Vani, would you like to answer that one?
I'm not sure my process changes very much, because at some point in the drafting stage, it always happens that I simply have to isolate myself and go into a sort of feral mode of concentration, which takes as much time as it takes. I mean, definitely with collaborative work, such as the theatre work around Skin and Hold, there's a lot of reading aloud and moving about and making things in the company of people. But to get to the point of anything written, I do have to find isolation. And also, even if a piece is just for the eye, I'm always muttering and reading things aloud because my first training was in music. So no, not much difference.
Thanks, that's so interesting. And I have a question from Florian, which is, how's the culture of reviewing changed from poetry in the past couple of years? And are reviews still important? Would either of you like to answer that one? Do you have thoughts on that, Maya?
I don't really know anything about like reviewing of art, or I mean, I do know about it, but I don't really have kind of any insights. So I don't know if Vani, you want to say anything on that?
Yeah, I guess your work, because it's so so interdisciplinary and moving between art forms, you probably find that it falls between the conventional spaces of categorized art forms that have one page for poetry, another for fiction, and all the pages all together diminishing over time. Vani, how about you? Do you have any thoughts on that question?
I think reviewing of different types of poetry in the UK has become a bit better over the last 2 years. What makes me furious is that reviewing is often unpaid labour, because a good review is easily 2 to 3 days' work. And the other thing is we need to de-hierarchize, which I know isn't a word, but I've had too much coffee, what places matter. So, I mean, if you're reviewed in Jamaica, does it matter more or less than if you're reviewed in England? And does it matter more or less than if you're reviewed in Australia or India? And if so, why or how? And also, how is it that a poet who's famous in one bit of the Anglophone world still has to be introduced in another? There's some very large gaps there. And what I'd like to mention is just the question of internet poverty as well, that within the UK and also very much elsewhere in the world, but even within the UK, which surprises people sometimes to hear, internet access isn't necessarily easily available or even available at all. So I think what could be interesting is for people to do more in terms of downloadable PDFs. So generally speaking, downloadables that can be printed and recirculated. That would be a great way to circulate reviews, because how else do people know what to go and read? They'd be dependent on prize lists. Wouldn't that be a pity?
A great pity, and a great point about accessibility and assumptions about what kinds of audiences will access poetry and have the right to access it and the ability to access it in different forms. Absolutely should be talked about more. Any other questions from the audience? If anyone would like to ask a question in person, turn on your mic, please. You could use the reactions button with a clapping symbol if you'd like to, or post a question in the chat. Anyone else? Well, in that case, please do if you think of something. But towards the end of the session, I really wanted to move back to the work and to one of Vani's poems from the new collection, which is this tree poem that connects with a stillness exercise, which I thought would be a lovely thing for us all to do, to bring it back to this idea of interactivity and engagement, and the experiences we'll have of poetry and art online, because we can't all be in a room together. So Vani, would you like to introduce us to that and to the poem?
Yes, I mean, before the pandemic started, I had already chosen silence, crisis, and excess as the themes I wanted to focus on during my residency at the University of York, where I'm right in residence. And it's a wonderful place with geese on the campus. So when it's possible to visit again, I really recommend that you visit the geese. And I mentioned the geese because they make a particular sort of noise. And at York, you can see, or one used to be able to see, students sitting near the lake and able to read or talk while in the company of particular noises. And I've been thinking about how silence isn't really the absence of noise, but the presence of a kind of surround sound, or the relationship to surrounding sound. So either the right kind of surround sound or the right relationship to surrounding sound, which then lets you connect your interior silence with surround silence. And I should say that I'm in no way connected to the Jesuits, but it was often Ignatian spirituality site that I found an interesting stillness exercise that I've been doing. And this involves, and I invite you to do this, listening to the outermost rim, the outermost circle, the outermost bit of sound that you can hear. And just note what that is and be aware of it for yourself, but don't particularly dwell on it. And now remain aware of that. I'm here in New Haven in Edinburgh, and you can hear some cars rather far away. And then come in a little closer. And what's the next closest thing you can notice? And I'm noticing the absence of seagulls, because there would normally be seagulls at around that sort of middle point. The traffic, the absence of seagulls. In my immediate working environment, there's the hum of the computer. And in my own interior space, I'm dehydrated, so I can hear the inside of my mouth. That's unattractive, but true. And I luckily don't have any noise in my head. I seem to have forgotten everything anyone else told me this morning. And that's the soundscape where I am. And to make it a little bit more dialogic, in these times when we're supposed to be isolating from each other in order not to kill or maim each other, I started doing this within the company of particular trees. Here are a couple of those trees. 1. Moss to Mozart. The fire tree is now a moss tree. The leaves which had it standing in a pool of fire have dropped and not been cleared. Assimilated into silt, they make mud of the road. The tree stands in its own delta. Moss clumps on its torso, way past the main fork. Moss covers every side of the tree except the east side, which could be mistaken for the north. More traffic arrives from the west. More pedestrians arrive from the east. The traffic breaks for the lights. Pedestrians talk about walking. I search for birds, which become unimaginable. The lichen is numerous-fingered. If I could have translated piano practice into botany, the lichen is that Mozart phrase my left hand trialed endlessly. The lichen is an A major. Here I'm looking at how there's a bleed between sight and sound for me because I'm very visually driven as a person, but also how there's somatic memory, which is oral memory of piano practice, and that makes a sort of synesthetic memory, even though I'm not particularly synesthetic. I'll do one more like this for you. First person arboreal. The fire tree picked out in its leaflessness by sodium lighting looks like things other people may not have seen. Frozen waterfalls in winter, jets of water frozen by strobe lighting. It is pale and I am tired. I lean against it and close my eyes. Before hearing the sounds far away from us, I must forget the sounds I made getting here. The bough I kicked, the creak of my coat, my feet in the mulch of dropped fire. I close my eyes and listen as if I were looking. Sound will not perform like sight. A road to the south roars like a curve. A road to the north roars stop-start. I feel quite sick. Solitary runners clump and make awkward diversions around us, bigger than needed just for the tree. For my humanness, not my size, makes the tree bigger. We are obstacle. How much of what I expect from hearing is touch? The cold wind flips and ripples my hair across my forehead, and it feels like it should be a sound. I fool myself that I am hearing the hedge. It is tinnitus mingling with traffic in a small bay between my left ear and the tree trunk. I feel you while I hear me, as only you allow. That's me talking to the tree, which is what happens if you end up bubbling with a tree during lockdown.
Wonderful. That's such a lovely note to end on. To hear you reading that, it feels like one of the more embodied digital Zoom experiences we could have at this strange time. I think we're running out of time as it happens. So thank you so much, Maya and Vani, for joining us and for these wonderful performances and for sharing your rich thoughts. Thank you everyone for coming. I'd encourage you all to pre-order Vani's book, Like a Tree Walking, to buy both these wonderful poets' books, Maya's pamphlet Fossil, Vani's other wonderful collections, Venus is a Bear, Measures of Expatriation. You can order them from indie bookshops, bookshop.org, get them for your family for Christmas, and read more about their fascinating work on their websites, and do please try out Maya's wonderful interactive artworks and poetry on her website. So thank you all. I hope you'll be able to join us next week too for the next event in this series, which is features two novelists and prose fiction writers, Dina Nayeri and Rowan Hisayo Buchanan. But in the meantime, please could you join me by turning on your mics for a few seconds and giving Vani and Maya a round of applause. Thank you so much.
Everyone.
Bye for now.
Thank you.